I haven't done a video in quite a while. The reason being I'm lazy, and that's a sufficient excuse actually. I did do a kind of a draft, let's say, for something that I wanted to talk about, but then I realised it was too ranty or it wasn't efficient enough, and therefore I deleted it. But I feel like it's an appropriate time at the moment. But again, this is what I want to talk about in the video. Algorithms are obviously, a part of our daily ritual now, and it's difficult to know what page the general populace is on, whether that's with respect to the domestic population and the culture that you're from, or on an international scale, because the media tailors the information that we see on a daily basis on our news feeds and on our social media accounts to us as a singular audience. Whereas, of course, in earlier days when we relied on tabloids and broadsheets, people would gain a gist of what was popular news by what they'd see printed in and around them. That was the kind of only grasp one had of international affairs. However, I still think, accounting for that there is a popular slide, and I don't think that this is going to change much at all, but I do think there's a popular change in attitude towards the governing realm. I think a proportion of people have woken up since 2019, 2020, and the scam that was, which I think is the greatest chess piece, or chess move rather, ever played. I don't think history has ever seen a scenario whereby people were essentially imprisoned and people's autonomy was taken away from them on an international scale, irrespective of religion, race, culture, simultaneously. And I've been saying for 20 years at least that the world is centralized. People sadly still can't comprehend the idea that there aren't countries. There is no United States, Russia, China. All those individual countries amounting to 45, 46 in Europe don't exist. There are no countries in the world. There hasn't been a country probably since the Petrograd uprising, the Bolshevik uprising, or the Jewish uprising of 1917. And, that's another interesting piece, actually, another interesting point. There are aspects of history that we're propagandized with, indoctrinated with from youth in all schools. That's the First World War, the Second World War, all these major historical events. And the truth is taken out of the accounts, and it's replaced with fictitious accounts, essentially, and that's then replicated time and time again, not just in youth during standardized schooling, whether primary, secondary, or tertiary, but throughout people's lives. You see, if you tell a lie enough, and this is not verbatim, it's stolen as some famous kind of quotation or quote, it's, if you tell a lie enough times, it becomes the truth. It's all about replication. And that's what we see with so many things. And one of the things that I hear about, which I'm trying not to do myself, although I am guilty of it, which is a shame, is when people want to talk about something controversial, they'll introduce with the line, I've got to be careful with what I say. And that just shows what level we're at when it comes to the kind of the controlling aspect of our existence. There is a clique of people that follow Judaic practices. You see, even I'm censoring certain words here, but consciously, because this video will be banned. I promise you that. I've already had multiple strikes on accounts, and that in itself is sufficient evidence for the clique of individuals that we're talking about. People that reside in Israel have controlled the world for such a long time, it's incomprehensible to most people just how long this is. We're not talking about a couple of 100 years, we're potentially talking about thousands of years. The stories that were told of the pyramids being constructed by Hebrew slaves, it's all about reverse. It's all about this kind of reversing reality, this fictitious duality, this kind of replacing idiocy at the top of the chain and putting those in an intellectual position, or who should be in an intellectual position, at the base. It was actually the Egyptians that built the enslaved Egyptians that built the pyramids under the guise of the Hebrews, not the other way around. The Hebrews haven't been enslaved, probably ever. All these stories and tales that were told about the Second World War and the Holocaust and all this stuff, these tags, even the tag anti-Semitism is nonsensical because Semitic language groups encompass much of northeastern Africa, from Djibouti and Eritrea down to Somalia and Ethiopia. It has absolutely nothing to do with a religion whatsoever. Semitism, being Semitic, is being a part of a region within generally the Middle East and northeastern Africa. It's part of a language group. But all of these terms have been utilized by a single group to create a force field, a barrier against any intellectual opposition, any forceful opposition, any opposition of, all opposition of all kinds, let's say. And it's just, I'm not a particularly old individual. I wouldn't call myself senior yet, but I'm getting into my 30s, and like I said, I realized this a very, very long time ago, and it's the same sequence of events played in time and time again. It's the same stories, it's the exact same media threads. They just change the setting, a few little words here and there, throw in some fictitious pictures, and it's what people were being told in the 1950s, the 1970s, the 1870s, the 1850s. It goes back hundreds of years, this exact same nonsense. But what people are starting to realize, mainly because I think, like any empire, whether it's a business empire, whether it's a religion, when it expands too much, you get players within the group, within the theatrical scene, who start to become greedy. And one of the key elements in any group is symbolism. And the symbolism of the Masons and the Cordwainers and these networking groups and these big kind of satanic practices, let's say, that ascribe to religion, but they're not actually a part of the faith that they proclaim to be. So there's people that might call themselves Christians or Jews or Muslims or whatever, but they use that as a defense. Behind the scenes, they're up to all kinds of activities that couldn't be ascribed to those faiths. And I don't mean just the average person, because of course most people don't go to church or the synagogue or the mosque every single day and follow the practice of the faith that they claim to have. I'm talking about people of an actual serious faith, a faith that no one can possibly comprehend, something very dark and very deep and very occultist. It's almost similar to like a Zoroastrianism, which is still prevalent in places like Iran and Kurdistan and even down into Tajikistan. And it's aligned to that. It's these pagan practices that go back generations. I mean, if you look at the UK as an example, most famous pagan group would be the Druids, and their headquarters is in northern Wales. These people practice all kinds of things related to animal sacrifice, human sacrifice, this kind of stuff that was still being practiced in places like Papua New Guinea, the Amazon rainforest, at least as we know, until the late 90s, early 2000s, and probably it's still the case now in a smaller degree. But this is for them. It's something that's intrinsic to their survival. Their survival is the deep and dark. It has to be. If you want to pursue a kind of immoral lifestyle, you have to implement fear upon your subjects, and your subjects are those that create this system. This is an administration, if you like. There's people in all aspects of living, whether it's healthcare, politics, policing, engineering. Places like CERN in Switzerland, they have their own diplomatic immunity. They have underground tunnels that go between France and Switzerland and Germany. And these underground tunnels also exist in pretty much any culture, to be honest, but they're obviously more pronounced in places like London or Paris catacombs being famed, of course. And there are all the historical narratives that they supplant in the mainstream and supply the general population who don't have time to question, are of course ludicrous. I mean, often they're just completely bail out on answering altogether, because it would almost raise more questions than need be. It's just like with the pyramids, people still can't explain this kind of this profound archaeology. And I can promise you this, I've said this before, I've been traveling for almost 12 years continuously, okay? And I've always been interested in what we would call history. And I've been to thousands of sites critically, looking and analysing many of them. And I've seen archaeologists working on such sites less than a handful of times. All of these narratives that they supplant about sites in France, Mesolithic sites, Paleolithic, Iron Age, Stone Age, whatever nonsense word they ascribe to these subjects, it's just all fugazi. It's absolute bullshit. All of it. I promise you, it's nonsense. Everything's nonsense. Whether it's the Renaissance, medieval Europe in the Dark Ages, the Romans, the Greeks, the Mayans, the Incas, the Aztecs. It's all fictitious for the most part. There's no one there digging a ditch, dedicating their life, for the most part, again, to the specific archaeological site. Most of these people are part of the very same networking groups that I've spoken about before and earlier in this video. It's all just nonsense. It's all just theatre. I mean, that's really what the game is about. It's about, in fact, ironically, the most important trait, the most important characteristic to have when ascribed to these fraternal organisations is the ability to act. And I've always said that the best actors, the most pronounced actors, aren't those who are classified as Hollywood movie stars. It's actually the politicians and the people in the public eye. I mean, I see through these people now as to the people that I know and kind of socialise with and talk about these things with. You see people like Elon Musk or Andrew Tate. These people are all actors. They're not real. Andrew Tate's not a real person. These people probably work for, I can't remember the name now, but there's a British, I guess, the security services in essence. In fact, that guy, there was a kind of, his protege went to acting school with Orlando Bloom. They have all of these beta runs, and they kind of release them into the public eye when necessary. Elon Musk is just a nobody as well. This guy doesn't sit in an office, calculating and creating all of these giant corporate interests. And these people are all actors. They're not real. It's the same bloodline behind every international corporation. And there's so many great examples that have been that are kind of not debatable anymore. There's so much substance to the evidence against this particular group. And for people that are interested, the Sassoon family is a prime example. They're Sephardic Jews that were brought up in the United Kingdom, but originally from Iran, and they were a sort of secondary family to the Rothschilds. Everyone knows of the Rothschilds. It's almost becoming quite conspiratorial. People don't even kind of see them as kind of a true family anymore. They're talked about so often in kind of these cheap Instagram reels and TikTok reels that people kind of look over it as some sort of baloney. But it's it's just a basic fact that this family is a prominent family that runs the Vanguard investment group. So it's not something that's to be overlooked. But if you look at the other families that are ascribed to the same ideology, the Sassoon family were those that ran the opium trade and essentially almost ran the East India Company. And that's another thing people forget. They think of the East India Company, or most people don't even know about the East India Company. Probably the earliest corporation. There was a Dutch protege, if you can call it that. That was slightly more influential at the time, but the East India Company took over as a result of the British Empire being more pronounced than any other kind of empire at that period. And they would run the opium from China into Europe, and it's the same system and the same formula that they've been doing now in North America in particular, with the cartel substances being shipped into all the various cities and creating epidemics on a kind of profound level. But interestingly, it's the same family responsible for that as well. Hong Kong Shanghai Bank was the bank that was used to funnel all of this cash around the world. And even quite recently, 15 odd years ago, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank received the largest fine in US history. And I've repeated this time and time again because I think it's a very easy way for people that are perhaps critical and suspicious of kind of alternative history to really look into the facts and see it for what it is. Hong Kong Shanghai Bank was fined over $1 billion, which is absolutely nothing. Of course, it's petty cash. It equated to 1 month's profit for HSBC. And they were the bank for the Sinaloa cartel, which is the biggest cartel of our age. And it was, they were so involved that the glass fronts to the cashier registers in each branch in Mexico were removed to enable the cartel to deposit larger sums of cash in the briefcases, which before couldn't be kind of swept underneath the cashier's kind of glass counter because there wasn't enough depth. So HSBC management had all the the glass removed, so the depth was increased and more cash could be deposited by the cartels. And the figure that's of course ascribed to the opium wars, the deaths resulting not just from conflict, which is usually quite minimal, but from addiction in China throughout the 19th century, is tens and tens of millions of people. And it's the one family that is responsible for that. And I mean, you could take it to the next level and say the family is this Judaic family, one of the tribes of Israel that go back thousands of years, let's say, and are pagan in their worship. They don't actually align to the practices of Judaism, but they use religion, like many people do and many organizations do, to front their sickening endeavors. And we're talking about absolute deep and dark pagan ritual here, which is what happens when people join fraternal orders and they reach certain degrees within those brotherhoods, we'll say in inverted commas. But people, I think naturally creatures of all kinds want honesty to be intrinsic to their livelihoods, whether it's human beings or animals or whatever. It's something that fundamentally we want because we rely on it. Our survival depends on hoping that others are acting in the best interest of the community rather than going out and pillaging and raping and murdering. So if someone tells you, they're an imam, or someone tells you that they're a rabbi or a priest or whomever, a police officer, people give these characters the benefit of the doubt. But we're really playing with fire here. Our society has been playing with fire for a long time because these people don't operate by the general rules, which is why they've always been above society. They take advantage of everyone, they leech off of everyone. And there are terms like lizards, chameleon that have been applied, and unfortunately there are retards that take this literally to mean that there's some kind of extraterrestrial life form that's landed and they're kind of mirroring creatures on planet Earth. But no, it's of course all metaphorical. These people have always been chameleons and lizards. They kind of bind themselves to society and mirror and mimic those around them, and no one can tell the difference between who is really a part of said community and who isn't, and that's why they're so successful. And they obviously pit one side against the other. They create civil wars, they create endemic and indefinite conflict. And it's the same characters, and most people are fully aware of who they are, and I've spoken about them often. They're people that are ascribed to Judaism, and everyone's too fearful to do anything about it. In the last couple of weeks, the Canadians, who aren't the first, have imprisoned people for questioning the Holocaust, or what we are taught to call the Holocaust, right? Which is just a apparent genocide of people which happens everywhere in the world at all times, in all continents, all races and religions have experienced deaths on a more substantial level, as I just evidenced with the opium wars in China, where the deaths amounted to probably 2 to 3 times at least what is claimed the figures are with respect to the Jewish population in the Second World War. Nobody talks about that, and even more ironically, those that killed those people were actually Jewish. And if you look at the something more recent in our history that's appropriate because it's the same historical timeline as the so-called Holocaust, is the rise of the Bolsheviks and the creation of the USSR. And the creation of the USSR relied on the mass murder of millions and millions of Russian people before the Second World War even started. The most notable being the Holodomor massacre in the Ukraine, which amounted objectively to over 3 million civilians. Whereas the Holocaust is very debatable, figure-wise, based on Jewish records. The Jewish Almanac, for example, of 1937 shows that it would be absolutely impossible for those numbers to have been, let's say, exterminated based on the birth rates at that time, the birth rates after the Second World War also in continuing almanacs. Whereas these kind of genocides in, say, the Holodomor, the Ukraine in 1933, I believe it was, although it could be slightly earlier and slightly later, the 30s, but preceding the Second World War. No one speaks about these. And guess who was responsible for that as well? Jews. I mean, if you look at who was responsible for the rise of the Bolsheviks, it was actually the Schiffer Bank of New York who funded the Bolshevik uprising. Both Lenin and Trotsky were paid in gold bullion from the United States. Nearly all of the fighters responsible for overthrowing what is being commonly referred to as White Russia, which is Tsarist Russia, were Jewish. The slogans, the pamphleteering, let's call it, the propaganda was all in Yiddish, not Russian. No one realizes that at the time in 1917, when Petrograd was overthrown to become Leningrad, now commonly known as St. Petersburg, all of the writing around the walls, the graffiti, the manifestos, was all written in Yiddish, not Russian. Lenin was, of course, of the same origin, as was Stalin. Interestingly, had 3 Jewish wives and spoke Yiddish as well, but apparently he wasn't Jewish, which is very unbelievable. And then Lenin, and the biggest, let's say, the kind of the crowning member of their organization, whose name slips my mind, it begins with F. He was responsible for all of the gulags, the mass murders of tens of millions of people of all races, all across not just, let's say, what is now the Russian Federation, but all of the territories that became the USSR, but were kind of being merged under this kind of communist socialist banner. He was Jewish as well. No one talks about that. If we look at who owns Reuters news agency, who owns the pornographic industry of today, X-rated, obscene things that people see online, it's all owned by Jews, all of it. And actually, the child abuse and the rapes and no doubt murders involved in that industry have been proven. None of the content could have been filtered at all. Apparently they had less than a handful of people that were responsible for moderating all of these X-rated websites, and it still happens to this day, and it's actually been sold and repurchased by other Jewish people since, because it's all a scam. You look at the biggest defense contractors in the world, you look at pretty much every major corporation, because the thing is, the biggest investment firms, at least on paper, are Vanguard and BlackRock was unofficially absorbed by Vanguard in May of 2021, although no doubt they're one and the same from the off. But if you are the kind of overarching supreme corporate interest that has essentially just absorbed everything else, whether it's British Petroleum or Coca-Cola, Moderna, Pfizer, all of these, multi-billion, maybe even trillion-dollar corporations are nothing in the grand scheme of things, because they're all majority owned by these huge hedge funds, and these huge hedge funds are the people that literally print capital. And again, I've said this before, but when you put it into perspective like this, it scares a lot of people. But the thing is, this system, I know it sounds very kind of unbelievable, and to an extent it is, but the entire system just relies on people's complicity. It doesn't exist unless you play your role in its existence. Everything that you buy at the supermarket, everything that you just the way you formulate your sentences, what you choose to talk about when you're down the pub or the cafe on a Sunday evening at 7 p.m, you're smoking shisha or drinking coffee with your friends. Now what people are doing is they're self-censoring. The system is self-fulfilling, because it doesn't even often require the police or the kind of subservient characters that perform the administration of governance. It's each and every individual, people like ourselves, we self-censor ourselves. We question, should I be saying these things, because you may lose your job. You lose your job, you can't pay your mortgage. You can't pay your mortgage, you can't feed your children. These are the things that go through people's minds, and it's very logical, of course. And they make it so that you see evidence of this, so that if you question yourself and you're on the fence, you'll turn on your phone and there'll be a news article there, and it will say, as I've just exampled, man has just been imprisoned in Canada for questioning the Holocaust. I mean, in Canada, this self-proclaimed liberal state, there's people that can go and rape and murder, and often they get a suspended sentence. I mean, it's really that insane now, and it's all by design. But if someone questions some historical so-called fact, they go to prison. I mean, just think about how mad that is. You think that's normal? Do you think if something's true, naturally true, that you have to punish people for questioning its existence? If someone says to you, this wooden chair it derives from a cedar tree that we cut down in California, or whatever tree, and someone says, no, that's not wood, that's made of plastic, even though it's quite clearly wood. Would you throw them in jail for that? Would you throw somebody in jail for saying that they don't believe in the First World War or the Second World War? I mean, people have the right to believe whatever they want, even if you think it's farcical, ludicrous, madness. It's just speech at the end of the day. So when you start throwing people in prison behind bars, away from their husbands, their wives, their children, because they decide to believe in something different than you, that really brings into mind, whether or not the information that is supposedly true is in fact true. That's my point entirely. And they're doing it everywhere. They did it in Germany a few years ago. They put a woman in jail. She was in her 80s, I believe, very elderly lady, and she just didn't agree with the Holocaust. Again, another example. She didn't believe in it, so they threw an 80-year-old woman in prison. She's never physically harmed anyone. This is also the same country, by the way, that calls itself liberal, but it also supplies Israel with armaments, while simultaneously they can get a tourist visa to Iran. So just think about that for a second. Germany supplies Israel with weapons, but Germany or Germans are allowed to visit Iran on tourist visas, yet countries like the UK are banned from visiting Iran. And the premise is that, of course, we're an enemy state. But my point, as I've reiterated numerous times, is there is no Iran, there is no Israel, there is no United States. They're all governed by the same people. This idea, this notion of countries and borders, it's not real. It's just not real at all. If you look at COVID as an example, the biggest scam of not just the century, in all known history, all of these acts, all these policies and legislation concerning, this so-called pandemic, were all implemented almost instantaneously by every country in the world, irrespective of their religion, their race, their geographic position, their culture as a whole. That's just not feasible in any society that's even remotely democratic, let alone democratic. And I don't believe in the notion of democracy, it's nonsense. Do you think it would be feasible for people to rush through these policies and legislations all mimicking one another at the click of a finger? And don't you find it very suspicious that, organizations like the WHO seem to have almost an entire worldwide membership? It's like, it's all just there for everyone to see. It's not real. It's all ludicrous. It's all fiction. It's all fugazi. And without going on a tangent, and to wrap up on the 30 mark appropriately, is the numerology involved in the symbolism pertaining to these occultist organizations, right? I went to the museum here in Muscat recently, and it's the same as any other museum in the world, some artifacts here and there, but what I always look for is the symbology concerning the leadership of said country. And what you'll see, no matter what country you go to, you can input it on Google, you don't even need to go physically to each and every museum, is the regalia that's there to be seen in the exhibitions. And here in Muscat, you'll see the same regalia that you'll see in Taipei and Taiwan, same regalia that you'll see in Dushanbe in Tajikistan, probably the Tower of London or various other museums and cultural institutions in the United Kingdom. You'll see the same in Paris, etc., etc. They're all part of the club, and you're not in it. They're all the Freemasons, they're all part of the various subsidiaries and alignments to those sickening organizations that essentially run on the idea that if you join and you do what we tell you to do, you get rewarded. And most it's compartmentalized, right? So most people don't realize, to what extent these organizations are complicit in the abuse of children, the absolute murder and rape of all kinds of individuals. They are a criminal organization, but people on the lower levels, the lower rungs of the ladder, will take their extra 50-60% salary, all of their benefits, their perks, and they're just, turn a blind eye from time to time, depending on where they stand and where they fit into that organization, whether they're a low-level politician, they're a researcher in, Pfizer or Moderna's labs, little things like this. The people that are members are always used They serve a purpose in the grand scheme of things, but they're of course usually not close to the top. So people just turn a blind eye. But this system functions on that. And just as with any system, if the police turn around and say we're not going to do our job, we're not going to enforce this governance any longer, the cards come toppling down. But for that to happen, people actually have to talk about these things, and that just requires something very basic that was seen, I guess, not too long ago, I hope, as something of to aspire for, and that's courage. Most people don't have courage anymore. People have become too comfortable in their existence with their phones and their Talabats, or Uber Eats for those in Europe, sitting in their apartment with a smart TV and Alexa on standby, and no one has the ability to think anymore because our access to information, it derives from the internet for the most part, and that's completely censored. If you want to find books that were in print 20, 30 years ago that would talk about controversial topics, they've basically blacklisted those now. I mean, all the publishing houses are formulated in the same kind of monopolistic sense as any other corporate entity. If you look at the big ones in the United Kingdom, which is WH Smith and Foyles, these publishing houses are basically owned by the same big investment firms that own all the newspapers, the tabloids, the broadsheets. So it's very difficult to find information. This idea that the internet has actually brought kind of freedom to people, it's given people the capacity to access information whilst on the go, to be mobile. It's actually completely the opposite, and it was designed for that purpose. www is 666 in Hebrew. There's no coincidence there. It's all by design. The thing is, again, one more thing to wrap up. The genius of the system is that it's there for everyone to see. They don't actually lie. There's symbolisms everywhere. You can go into an airport, you can go into the flagship branch of a major corporation, any bank, and you'll see the symbolism that's everywhere. They don't lie to people. And that's what makes people double think. They think, how is it possible that if everybody sees it, why is nothing happening? And it's because everyone sees it, everyone assumes that it's there to be seen, when it's quite the contrary. But anyway, I'll wrap up there. Again, just a little spontaneous sort of update. En route to Kasab now, which is part of Amman, north of the United Arab Emirates, for some hiking. And then I think I was going to go to Syria. I had kind of booked it all, but getting quite tired now. I've got the older you get, the busier you get. Actually, you accumulate so many things over the years that there's just really not enough hours in the day. So I think I might chill in Lebanon for a bit, and then we'll see. I have some trips planned thereafter to Bahrain and Turkey and Georgia and these places, but I'm not sure if I'll actually do the two weeks I had planned in Syria. I think it's just a little bit too much effort. I have some things to do, so I might kind of chill out in Beirut. Anyway, until the next time, au revoir.